Chapter 13. The Wounds of a Friend. Havilah jumped from rock to rock and kept her knife's cable extended and waiting to wrap and split any weapon she came across. She had put it in her mind not to hurt anyone and let her actions confirm her convictions. Seeing how easily her cord cut through their metal weapons, they began to make avoiding her more of a priority, imagining how well their skin would hold up to it. She smiled at their reactions. Intimidation was not something Grimm were prone to, and she had no hesitation in putting them down. As she understood them, these were people. Even if they meant her harm, she would give them respect so long as the materials they carried weren't standing between that peace being possible. Her hope was that they would just run. She would catch up to one and bring them to the instructor for questioning. However, it didn't seem like this was going to be the case. The moment they had lost their weapons, they simply got angry and rushed at her with their bare hands, or what remained of their gear. She decided to have a little bit of fun with them. Rebounding off a rock and into the shoulders of one of the men, the others that were charging her had made watching her erratic movements such a priority that they ran into each other. Laughing as she landed, she began to taunt them. "What's the matter? Can't keep up with the faunus?" One slammed his fist into the dirt and raised himself up. She rushed him and brought her knee up to his groin, putting him back on the ground again. His aura flickered out and weakly began crawling away. "Or is it because I'm a girl?" Her left ear pressed down as she sensed someone else charging her from behind. Remembering an old trick that almost broke a training dummy in half, she feigned an attempt to absorb the blow by falling into it. As the man's arms attempted to grab her waist and bring her to the ground, she purposely raised her knee and slid her heel out to catch herself the moment the man's weight was fully committed to its movement. She pushed herself with all her might to her left, leaving her knife blade below in the dirt. The man's advantage against her became his weakness as his sternum pressed onto the handle and evacuated all of the oxygen forcefully out of his lungs. Letting out a breath that resembled more satisfaction in the maneuver's success than fatigue, she tried pulling back the knife by the metal string and reattached it to her hand. The process was slower than she would have liked, but she didn't hear anyone nearby and thought it was more fun this way. She looked around and realized the loud noises closer to the school had stopped. Assuming it was good news on Gideon and Daniel's part, she decided to duck down and keep her ears open where she was until Olivia contacted her. With one hand on her scroll and the other on her blade, she moved over to the men she had disabled and made sure they didn't run off. The one she hit in the crotch would be down for another few minutes for certain. She had learned as much the hard way after an accidental sparring match with Gideon that she still hasn't stopped apologizing for. She laughed to herself. "Come on, Fox Lady, he forgave you for that before he even got up." Still, she always had a problem with him socially, rolling her shoulders as if the men around her weren't conscious. "Ah, well, I'll find a way to make it up to him." Placing her boot down on the man's bruised chest, she figured he was the one she'd need to be most concerned about. "So, where are you guys from?" He spat in the sand between coughs and tried to reach up for her. Luckily, his strength hadn't returned, and her body weight was enough to shrug it off. Figuring he was more trouble than he was worth, she stepped on his arms and began examining his forehead. "Let's see, it was right there." Slamming him unconscious with the hilt of her knife, she placed her fingers on his jugular to make sure she didn't hit too close to the man's temple. A pulse assured her, and she left him where he was. Moving over to the one she had hit hardest, she decided to sit on a rock and watch him writhe until he was capable of conversation. "We saw a good number of you when we came over here. What do you have against my school?" He glared and tried focusing on her despite the nausea and cramping that was clearly flooding his vision. With a sigh, she stood up and knocked him out as well. "I know a talker when I see him." She leaned down to his ear. "Careful looking at people like that. I have a friend that takes looks personally." Her ears shot up when she began to hear unfamiliar screaming and roaring. They then feel when she sensed motion behind her as well. Taking in all of this new information, she began to process the stress the only way she knew how. She started running. A quick decision was made, going closer to the school, a safer option than farther. She looked up at the rock and tried to recall the general direction she expected Daniel to have been, and started at a brisk pace. Once she had found her pace and began taking mental snapshots of her surroundings to remember where she left potential sources of information, she knocked out. Her head turned back towards the school and looked over a rock, only to find herself lose purchase on a stone and fall. Her ears hung in front of her eyes, and she grunted in frustration, picking herself up. Whatever she had slipped on must have been wet, because she felt her clothes clinging to her skin and dropping in temperature. She always enjoyed water where she could find it, but this felt wrong. It was thicker than she expected, and placed her hand down to feel it. In the darker sand, she lifted up her finger and found it to be red. She knew well what it was, but didn't want to know how it got there. She recoiled and tried distancing herself from it, only to find out the answer to the question she tried to avoid. The extra surge of adrenaline got her to her feet, and she had no intention of looking back at what she had brushed up against. The terror that greeted her was at least a familiar sight than the image she didn't want to take into her mind. "Gideon! Deathstalker!" His visor was gone, and he looked like he had been mauled by something. "What happened? Gideon, behind you!" She started to run his direction, but he wouldn't raise his head. The Grimm's tail readied itself at him and paid her no mind. She took advantage of this and loosed her cord from her knife. She used a nearby rock as a springboard and launched herself into the air to catch the falling stinger. Holding her arms out as far as she could, she found purchase right below the telson and wrapped it around the muscle as quickly as she could. With a sharp pull up, the stinger severed, and the impact that hit Gideon was only a blunt tail. Her eyes began looking around for her friend and couldn't see him anywhere. Forgetting where she was, she began calling out for him, hoping he hadn't been more hurt than he already was. She began to lose her footing on the tail as the beast began to thrash, but was surprised when the tail remained essentially where it was. She finally looked down and saw an unfamiliar spike protruding from the Deathstalker's tail. She then realized it was Gideon's blade. She jumped down and saw him standing exactly how he had before, not so much as straining his shoulder to keep the monster's body in place. As if she didn't exist, Gideon finally looked up and began pulling the creature back to meet his eyes. She knew exactly what was happening and began to distance herself from what was about to take place. Gideon loosed the blade from the tail and launched himself forward into the Grimm's white carapace. The force was so great that the beast was cut cleanly down the middle. Abandoning the normal sword style of finding gaps in the armor and aiming for vulnerable spots, the blade aimed directly where the beast was strongest and found it wanting. Without even a moan, the monster turned to ash, and Gideon began moving towards the next monster, a living embodiment of destruction, having just been born and unleashed upon the oncoming horde. It was all Havilah could do to stay where she was and hope she didn't find herself in his path. The instructor began giving out orders. "Royal and Azure, fall back to the school and prepare the medical equipment. Go to regroup with me. Now go." The teams nodded and took the school security with them. The instructor turned his head back to the rocks and started seeing familiar sights he wished he had left back in Atlas. "Just when their weapons had arrived too," he mumbled to himself as he signaled his helmet to begin recording. Revving up his trident, he began to hover above the battlefield looking for any signs of life. Gideon was easy enough to track, but his immediate attention began searching for his teammates and make sure they didn't find themselves in harm's way. Olivia revealed herself by activating her scroll. The radio waves were picked up almost immediately. His eyes narrowed to note her gesturing downward to who he quickly surmised was Daniel. Recovering from the cost of his maneuver, he got to his feet and seemed confused by the absence of enemies around him. "Olivia," he signaled, "get Daniel and fall back to the school. He's not hurt. Let's keep it that way." As fruitless a gesture as it was, she nodded into her scroll and began making her way down. He smiled at that. One so suited to her environment, when at rest among her friends, she always found a way to lighten the mood. When in class, she always had a way of playing the student almost to a fault, and now in combat, she behaved like a soldier. Taking orders without a word and trusting the execution to her training, his eyes went to Daniel as he began tenderizing where the shots had struck. That boy felt fear, but never seemed affected by it. Be it taking insults from other groups in competition or taking shots in training exercises, even at his own expense. He never lost his heart, even when it cost him something. Then there was Havilah. Finally picking up her accelerated heart rate, he began moving closer to gather more information. She wasn't an easy student, but she was dedicated. When she set her mind to something, she pursued it to its end and even farther. She never stopped. That was a motivation that was contagious. It was no wonder Tim recommended her for leadership of her team. His eyes narrowed then. That was the problem. They were still children. With every strength came a corresponding weakness. Olivia's adaptability lacked structure. She needed direction in order to find herself where she would be most effective. Without Daniel, he didn't know how she would function. Training or not, Daniel was a curious one. He was willing to suffer, and almost seemed to embrace it too readily. He could take a hit, but he wasn't invincible. This martyr complex was something he had to be careful with. The human psyche can only handle so much pain before breaking. That's where Havaliah came in. Her example was her strength, but her strength itself was a weakness. She never knew fatigue, and this often caused her to go farther than others could follow, sometimes even expecting from others the kind of strength and motivation they simply didn't have. Gideon was the anchor of the group, meek to a fault. His boundless strength was perpetually kept in check. It cost him effectiveness on the battlefield save for the most desperate situations, yet even in those moments his strength was most needed. Therein lay the problem. He had seen what he was capable of when he found him as a child. He had the strength to tear an Ursa apart with his bare hands so long as he made contact with it first. Yet his nature always seemed to see that strength turned against those he cares about. The incident with Red came to mind. But so long as his nature remaining as it was, the only ones capable of being harmed by him were those who deliberately wished him harm, or put themselves in harm's way. Havaliah's signal suddenly flared on his field display and disappeared. He blinked to refresh the signal. Once, twice, again and again, her vitals had gone dangerously low. No, he breathlessly voiced as he accelerated his trident towards her last known location, hoping his assumptions were wrong. Gideon's blade was drawn towards the Grim like a magnet. The force that propelled him was nothing less than pure hunger, a desperation that drove it onto the bodies of his enemies, and returning them to the ashes they were spawned from. Yet this fang's hunger was only an end to the wielder's means to provide it. Gideon himself was nothing less than a hurricane. The moment malice was exposed to his vision or body, he became the false vision of destruction and all it desired to be in living form. A bully's desire for dominance was honestly shown back to them as a fiend stronger than they could ever hope to be. A murderer's pursuit of sensation or relief saw themselves become the victim as their darkest fantasy was unleashed upon them. The Grim weren't malevolent or cruel. They were simply vessels of the destroyer himself. When Gideon allowed himself to truly reflect what they were, the will of a god turned on itself, with him as its catalyst. A group of Beowulf were drawn into the violence only to find themselves eviscerated, the most fleeting of blows slayed wherever they struck. Gideon was lost to the frenzy. All that he was had been replaced by something else. What stood before him had taken his very soul over, and a power that should not conceivably be able to function in a world ruled by law wreaked havoc. The Grim roared their defiance, but he only roared back, the very sound waves sundering the ground below them. He hurled himself forward in pursuit of more slaughter. The man he was being defied the ability to return by what he had become. Searching for more Grim to make contact with, his unmatchable speed and power paused only to allow each beast a chance to see and pour their malice into their soon-to-be executioner. Geists and Beowulfs began to flee. The Ursas hesitated in the wake of such display of destruction. A Goliath rose from among them, unable to control itself as it was driven on by such a concentrated presence of hatred and despair. Gideon didn't even hesitate. His black eyes narrowed as he spun on his heel and took the time to annoy the beast before dispatching it. He leapt on the beast's back, and its tusks thrashed fruitlessly against the nearby rocks. Steadying himself, he allowed his blade to guide him to a weak point at the base of its neck. The moment its direction was clear, he snapped the blade in half and hurled the tip into the monster's skull. A sonic boom echoed through the valley as the blade exited the Goliath's mouth. Its death throw faded as quickly as its body, while Gideon lost purchase and fell into the now fleeing horde. They turned, sensing a moment of weakness. His sword was shattered, his body was attempting to recover, and with a single purpose they all turned and leapt upon him. Gathering their will to destroy a single target, it was the last movement they ever made. Channeling what seemed to be his aura, the blade's regeneration was accelerated in moments to double its original width and length. For the first time since the battle started, he grasped the blade with both hands and swung its jagged edge in an arc, bisecting every last grim within reach, and allowed their ashes to complete their futile attempt to end him. The specks either evaporated before reaching him or flecked harmlessly off of his cracked and bloody armor. Growls and voices murmured from his mouth as his body began to shuffle to and fro looking for a target that wasn't there. His berserk frenzy had ended, and its power began to leave him. His eyes slowly returned to the state of a blackened mist not too far from a storm cloud. The monster tried to act, but found no purchase. The beast roared within him, but only left his voice as a groan. A breath of relief left his mouth as Gideon's consciousness began to emerge. At the moment his eyes finally resembled a human's again, he heard a voice nearby that sent him into a panic. His heart broke the moment a silhouette emerged from the dust cloud surrounding him that resembled both human and beast, young woman and coyote. Her stance was unmistakable, an aura of confidence only complemented by her flawless athletic physique. Her calves and lateral muscles instinctively flexed as she drew closer to confirm whether it was him or another grim. Empty exhalations more sounded like one waking from a nightmare than any warning that even he would heed. She thought it was a grim. She saw him as a threat. She intended to kill him until further examination proved otherwise. The moment her eyes met his, a transition between fear and hatred became surprise and joy to see her friend was still alive, passed in an instant. Yet that instant was all the time it took for his eyes to go black and his blade to immerse itself between her ribs.